For my presentation, I decided to research the sources and reporting of oil spills and impacts on wildlife from 1970 to 2018. The goal of this study is that there is a global need for increased consistency of reporting and availability of data of oil spills and wildlife impact. This review searches current literature and publicly available databases covering almost 5 decades and summarizing global data on oil spill incidents, sources, and whether they reported effective wildlife. This study used many different sources in their research. To start off, they used scientific journal articles, literature from the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Office of Response and Restoration, Historical Incidences Database, the Center of Documentation, Research, and Experimentation on Accidental Water Pollution, and papers from the Proceedings of the International Oil Spill Conference. Before we dive deeper, I wanted to throw in some background information. From 1970 to 2018, millions of tons were released from over 1,700 acute oil spills. Out of these 1,700, only 312 reported the wildlife effects. Acute oil spills are considered to be anything more than 7 tons from one source, and this does not account for the natural seeps of oil from the seafloor or any spills that were from war. So in this study, they used a different measurement of tons. Their ton is equal to 2,204.6 pounds, where ours is 2,000. So I decided to throw this in just to make it a little bit easier to understand. In order to get a better idea of the progress that we have made so far, I decided to add in some history of oil spills. Starting off, one of the first reported and one of the biggest oil spills that we have seen was the terrestrial spill of Lakeview Gusher in California in 1910. Spills have been increasingly reported during the 1960s from oil tankers, but it was not until the late 60s until impacts and responses were also recorded. The Santa Barbara platform oil spill in 1969 was a major influence on the American environmental movement. This kicked off the U.S. National Environmental Policy Act, the U.S. Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972, the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. Another important oil spill to look back on was the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989. This created global media reporting and lots of attention. This brought about the U.S. Oil Pollution Act of 1990, and it made oiled wildlife response in the United States mandatory. But to this day, we are still not receiving the attention it needs internationally. So when we categorize oil spills, there are many different factors. Start off, we have the year, location, environment, whether it was in water or on land, the source of the spill, the kind of oil, the estimated spill volume, and if wildlife was reported affected. If it was, they take into consideration the total number of carcasses collected and the approximate total numbers of wildlife captured, oiled, and rehabilitated. When we begin to look at the sources of spills, we can put them into many different categories. To start off, we have oil tankers, which include barge tankers, non-oil tanker shipping, which is just general shipping, wells and platforms, pipelines both in the water and on land, terrestrial refinery and tank spills, trucks and trains, and other, which is predominantly aircraft. 95% of trucks and trains and other are only reported in North America and represent less than 3% of all oil spills reported globally. It's important to note that the major source of oil spills comes from general shipping. It shows the highest and most continuous increase in the last 5 decades. The results of this slide looks at where the oil comes from. Out of a total of 1,702 oil spills reported, 80% were from U.S. mainland and territorial waters. 96% of these spills were from the Northern Hemisphere, 47% were from general shipping, which includes cargo, bulk carriers, cruise ships, military, and fishing vessels. 23% come from oil tankers and oil tanker barges, and they show a decline in incidents in the last 2 decades. 12% are from pipelines, which has shown a steady minor increase. 9% come from terrestrial refineries and tanks. 6% comes from wells and platforms, and 3% comes from trucks, trains, and other. When we look at how wildlife is impacted by oil spills, they become impacted directly and indirectly. Wildlife makes contact with oil through physical contact, ingestion, inhalation, and absorption. When feathered or furred wildlife preen or groom, they ingest the oil on their bodies. This leads to internal contamination, which causes endocrine and hormone disruptions. All oil, including light, intermediate, and heavy, interferes with the water repellents. Animals lose their ability to fly, dive, swim, float, and thermoregulate. When they lose this ability, it may lead to hypothermia, drowning, and death. So how have wildlife impacts been reported? 312 out of 1,702 spills reported impacts to wildlife. Of the 312, 78% were from crude and heavy fuel oil spills, 15% were from light oil spills, and 7% were from intermediate oil spills. 2% explicitly stated that wildlife was not observed to be affected. 80% of reported spills did not mention any wildlife. The overall reporting of affected wildlife per source was 37% came from all truck, train, and other, 30% of all tanker spills, 29% from pipeline spills, 19% from well spills, 15% from terrestrial spills, and only 9% from general shipping spills. The predominant species reported affected was 45% birds, 45% air-breathing wildlife, which includes marine mammals and reptiles, and 10% non-air-breathing wildlife such as fish. 121 of the 312 reported wildlife impacts reported rehabilitation of wildlife. There was no clear relationship between spill size and number of wildlife reported dead. 86% of all reported spills were in marine environments, and there was almost 16 million tons of oil recorded spilled in the last 5 decades alone. These results appear to have a blatant bias to wildlife reporting when spills are publicly visible, such as terrestrial spills, which these spills are likely to be very visible to the public given that it is on land. On the other side, but still is visible, tanker and well spills are usually extremely publicly obvious due to their size and rarity, causing higher publicity and likely to have coordinated oiled wildlife responses and therefore higher rates of wildlife reporting. It is the reporting of wildlife impacts from general shipping sources that appears to be disproportionately low, which could be from several reasons. 1. They do not necessarily occur near land or in public view. 2. Spills from ships are proportionally more likely to be light or intermediate oil. Fuel types are lighter in color and shorter in persistency, and they are less likely to be thought of or seen to be affecting wildlife. To simplify things, the most obvious result from this analysis regarding location of reported spills is that there is an enormous geographical gap in publicly available data on reported oil spills. 1,362 of the 1,702 spills analyzed from U.S. waters. This is due to the existence of the NOAA database, where oil spills are consistently reported and are publicly available. The first recommendation is to encourage all governments and industries to require publicly available reporting of oil spill events. The second most noticeable result from this review regarding wildlife is that wildlife impacts are not proportional to the size of the oil spill. Wildlife is not only impacted by crude and heavy oil fuel types, but also by all oils. However, due to crude and heavy fuel oil color and persistence, it appears wildlife impacts are reported more often from crude and heavy fuel oil spills rather than lighter spills. Crude and heavy fuel types are more visible and have greater persistence in the environment, allowing more time for wildlife to come in contact with it. 78% of the 312 spills reported wildlife impacts are from crude and heavy fuel oil spills. Overall, in considering impacts of oil spills on wildlife, it is more important to consider where an oil spill occurs in relation to densities of wildlife rather than what oil type or how much oil was spilled. In conclusion, this review demonstrates obvious gaps in availability of data and reporting of oil spills and associated impacts on wildlife globally. 80% of all reports in this analysis were from only one country, being the United States, resulting in major unequal coverage of reporting across the world regions. From the availability of records of oil spills, there also appears to be significant lacking of reporting and/or observation and reporting of wildlife effects. A few trends that we have noticed is the number of oil tanker spills is decreasing. And in general, the amount of oil spilled has decreased from most spill sources. However, there are also continuing negative trends such as oil spills reported from general shipping, which has increased significantly across the time frame of this study. When all shipping spills are considered, shipping is responsible for significantly greater numbers of oil spills than all other sources combined. Another takeaway from this study is that there is a need for a three-tiered approach, including integrating industry, local, national, and global preparedness. Given the increasing numbers of spills reported by general shipping particularly, there appears to be a lack of regulation, legislation, or industry responsibility taken by general shipping over preparedness for oiled wildlife response. In many countries, oil industries are regulated, requiring response plans including oiled wildlife response before drilling or operations are undertaken. These regulations do not appear to exist or are limited for shipping in most areas. Here are just a few recommendations to go forward. We should increase consistency of reporting and availability of data of oil spills globally. We should increase the understanding of the effects of oil spills, as well as strengthening laws, regulations, policies, or other official directives. And we should ensure governments and industries to develop plans and protocols for wildlife response across all tiers of response to ensure wildlife are more frequently considered in oil spill preparedness responses. This study is from the Environmental Science and Pollution Research International and can be found in the SUNY Cortland Public Library database. Thank you.